welcome to our show,
Hello.
another Takeoff Monday. I'm Rosanna Catalano, and of course, my co host is, I'll let her take it away.
Hi, I'm Joy Tootle.
And of course, we have the fabulous, I'll let her introduce herself, our moderator.
Hi, I'm Chrissy Souders, and I'll be sharing your questions and comments with Rosanna and Joy throughout today's broadcast.
We're excited once again about today's topic. It's something that I think we've all experienced, or at least I have on a couple of occasions, and that's how do I leave an employer to start my new business? There's things about that I don't think a lot of people give a lot of thought to, and it's something that I think you really do need to be strategic about. There's a lot to consider. I think a lot of people just start their new venture and they put in their 2 weeks notice and they think that's the end of it. And unfortunately, sometimes they don't recognize documents that they've previously signed, agreements that they've made with their employer, and, a lot of other factors that they should take into consideration when leaving their employer. So let's get started, shall we? So the first thing that you really need to consider when you're leaving an employer is, what kind of boss do you have? You really need to take into consideration the personality of your boss. And not only the boss that you have that's right above you, that you directly report to, but you need to take into consideration the pressures that person is under and who they report to. So you really need to look at your chain of command and figure out what the personalities are there. Has your boss been supportive of other things that you've done? Have they been supportive of you getting additional education to get more skills for your current job? Have they been supportive of you when you've needed to take a couple of days off here and there to attend to some things in your personal life? Have they just been overall a supportive boss? Have they cracked under pressure? Maybe they are supportive, but the person above them isn't. And when they get the edict from that person, everything changes. So you really need to look at that chain of command and see what the factors are there and how that will affect you. The personalities will affect your timeline and how much information you share and when you share it with your current employer.
And for sure. If you don't mind, I'll just pop in here. I would say observe how not just their interactions with you, but over time, if you've been working for a while, how they've reacted to other people leaving and how other people, when there's been challenges, that might give you a clue in your history to see, well, is this boss going to be supportive of me because they were or were not supportive of this person, that person, and this other person that is left. I would also point out that how you behave towards your boss and whether you want to discuss any of this with your boss beforehand also applies to your coworkers. You may not want to brag too much to your coworkers about all of your exciting new plans that you have in leaving your job. We've all had coworkers in the past, at least I do, and probably you too, Rosanna.
Yes.
Who've had a big mouth and wanted to gossip about what your plans are. And if this gets back to your boss when you haven't shared the information with your boss, that could get a little sticky. So you might want to keep your plans at the workplace quiet, depending on who you're working with.
That's right. Loose lips sink ships. Absolutely. And it stands in this circumstance as well. So you really want to be cognizant of that when you are figuring out what you're going to share and when you're going to share it with those that you work with. So keep all of that in mind. You also really want to pay attention not only to how they interact, how you interact with your coworkers, but other coworkers that have previously left to do something new. How have they been treated? Really pay attention to that. Did your best buddy at work, Bob, leave 3 months ago to start his own business? How was Bob treated? What was said about Bob? Did they give Bob a hard time? Did they let Bob work after he turned in his resignation? Did they actually let him work the full 2 weeks that he gave them? Those are the types of things you need to consider. The other thing, I'm going to let you jump in there, Joy.
Thanks. I would think another thing you'd want to think about is what type of business do you plan to open? Is it related to the business you're currently a part of, or is it completely different? In other words, will you be a competitor or competition for the business and your employer, or are you doing something completely unrelated? Because that makes a huge difference in the type of activities that you can go ahead and engage in while you're still employed. If you are going to be a direct competitor of the current business that you're working with, you will be very limited in what you can do. If the new enterprise is non-competing, then you might have more freedom. And it also matters what type of employee you are currently. Are you a key employee, a skilled employee, an unskilled employee? If you're not going to be a competitor, then as long as what activities you're engaged in don't interfere with your current job performance, you probably are going to have more freedom to be able to do things. You could make phone calls or rent an office. You could hire employees. You could start making plans if you are going to engage in a non-competing business. Now, there's some key things. You don't want to ever use your current employer's resources. You don't want to steal their information, use their telephone, use their smartphone, their laptops, their office supplies, even use their conference rooms. You don't want to do that. And you want to make sure that any activities you engage in to start working on your new business are conducted after hours. And after hours could potentially be tricky depending on what type of job you have. If you have a 9 to 5, it's a little bit easier to define. If you work from home and at all hours of the day and night, that might get a little trickier. So let's say you are opening a pizza restaurant and but you currently work for a pizza restaurant. Depending on whether you're the manager or you are just sprinkling the cheese, might make a difference. Whether you want to open up a pizza restaurant right across the street, well, that's clearly your direct competitor. If you want to open up a pizza restaurant 1,000 miles away, you may not be seen as a competitor. So facts of the cases are very different depending on your exact situation.
And that applies to various employers as well. I mean, you gave the pizza restaurant example, something that we're more familiar with in the legal field, a law firm. So a very different situation for a law clerk that's going to go out on their own and leave that employer. This is somebody that most law firms expect to be a temporary position. You don't usually see like, hey, I'm a 12-year law clerk. That's not normally how those types of positions work. Same with a young associate. So sometimes they're expecting that those folks are going to leave. But if you are a named partner, if you're a rainmaker in that situation, if you've been there for a number of years, the situation changes and how they view you, and your worth at that firm is going to change, and that's going to change your exit strategy. Absolutely. So the other thing I think you also need to think about is, did you sign anything? So many people forget that they've signed something at the beginning of employment. They've signed all kinds of documents and they don't realize that they are bound by them. So some of the things you need to check to see is if you signed an agreement that would prohibit you from being dual employed. That means you cannot be employed under any circumstances, even if it's not relevant to your current job. So even if you are a law clerk and you have you've signed that type of agreement, you then can't go work at a pizza restaurant. You're not permitted to be dual employed. So you want to check and see if that is something that you signed when you first got on with your current employer. Some other documents that you want to see whether you've signed or not, pull out those documents that little packet they gave you at the beginning when you were onboarding. Did you sign a non-disclosure agreement? This type of agreement prohibits you from using or disclosing your employer's trade secrets like customer lists. Did you agree to anything like that? Or did you sign a non-compete covenant? This covenant restricts your ability to compete with your employer for a period of time. I know, especially in professional services, for example, if you own a veterinary clinic and someone works for you, another veterinarian, you may have them sign a non-compete clause saying, hey, if you want to start your own veterinary clinic, you cannot do so within 5 years of employment with us, and you cannot do it within 5 miles of our clinic. So sometimes there's a geographical limitation on those, and there's usually a time period as well with the non-compete covenants. You know, courts have found that the efforts and money invested by an employer to help you become specialized in your work may be considered a vested interest that the employer has. So be aware if the employer has invested some schooling for you. You may be then liable for something with that employer, especially if you've signed a non-compete covenant. And lastly, you should also consider if you've signed a non-solicitation clause. These clauses usually prevent you from soliciting and getting current employees that you work with, colleagues, and former coworkers to come work with you. So if you're sort of planning your company with the idea that you're going to steal, you know, Sally and Bob from your office, you may want to think again if you've signed a non-solicitation clause. So be aware of these restrictions. You don't want to start your business with a lawsuit. That's very costly, and it will take a lot of your energy, and your energy needs to be focused on your new venture. So that's where your focus needs to be, and you just need to be cognizant of that with those particular documents.
And these documents may not even be formal documents that you're thinking of, well, I have these contracts in this file. Go back and look at whatever handbook, employee handbook you may have been given. It may have been updated. You may have signed something with regard to that employee handbook that you're agreeing to all the terms within that employee handbook. And there's maybe some of these particular nuances that are contained in that handbook. And I know a lot of times we get these when we first get employed and we don't look at them again. Go back and look at this again before you decide to leave employment or start your new business.
Spot on, spot on. I do think we have a couple of questions I'm seeing in our live chat. It looks like one of our questions is, if you want to not burn any bridges, how much notice should you give your employer? You know, the standard is always 2 weeks, but you really want to take into consideration the circumstances. Sometimes you want to give your employer a little more leeway than that, give them a little bit more notice, depending on what type of specialization you have and the types of skills. So yes, 2 weeks is standard, but sometimes you want to give more depending on your employer, the type of work you do, and the relationship. You know, this is all about keeping and maintaining that relationship. There's another question. It looks like, what are some issues you should be aware of prior to quitting? For example, insurance and benefits. You need to think about your insurance, absolutely, and your benefits, because those end when you end your employment. So you need to think about that. You need to take that into consideration, COBRA payments for your health insurance and those types of things. If you're relying on getting some dental work with your dental insurance and you're leaving your employment that provides you with that free dental insurance, those are the types of things you definitely need to think about in your exit strategy and your timeline.
Just to add on to your mentioning about give at least the 2 weeks notice, it's important to not burn those bridges. You want to leave in the most positive light as you possibly can. And sometimes that's impossible because you can't control the reaction necessarily of your boss or of your supervisor, but you can control your actions. And I know the reason you may be leaving is because you are frustrated or angry about your current situation. But if you can keep that in check and leave on positive terms, it will eventually benefit you. Your current employer could potentially be a supplier for your new business or a customer of your new business. You don't want your former employer to ruin your reputation with potential new customers or vendors. So you want to leave in a positive light as possible. Also, you never really know if maybe your new venture doesn't work out and you need to be reemployed. Do you need a reference, or do you need maybe that employer to take you back? I know I personally have experienced that. I went to pursue something different and that didn't quite work out. And I needed to come back. And because I had left on positive terms, my old employer took me back, and it worked out to be a wonderful relationship. And I don't know, Rosanna, you may have had the same thing happen to you as well.
I have had the same thing happen to me as well, where things just didn't quite work out the way you wanted, or your personal circumstances changed and you needed to go back to an employer. And if you have that good relationship, if you have kept and maintained that good relationship, then you can go back. So that's a wonderful feeling to have that. So it looks like we're about out of time today. We will continue to take your questions. If you email us, we'll put our email addresses up at the end of the show. So please contact us. Obviously, you can find us at rocketshipconsultants.com, and we'll be happy to take your calls and questions that you have on this topic. We really hope that your new venture is blessed and that your relationships will be all good ones. So have a great day.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.